you really have two choices here. You can argue that the West, and especially the United States, caused the crisis, or you can argue that the Russians caused the crisis. But that means that whoever you argue caused the crisis is responsible for this disaster. And it is important to understand that this is a disaster. Ukraine has lost Crimea. It's, in my opinion, going to lose the Donbass. And the only interesting question to me at this point is whether it's also going to lose more territory in the eastern part of its country. Furthermore, Ukraine's economy is wrecked. Its cities are in the process of being wrecked. The international economy is going to be badly affected by these events as they go on. This is going to have terrible consequences, I think, for the Democrats in the fall. Furthermore, it makes it difficult for the United States to pivot out of Europe and pivot to China, where there is a potential threat, which is China. Furthermore, we're driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, which makes no sense at all. And all at the same time, we're making Eastern Europe a very unstable region, and therefore forcing us to, if anything, up the ante there. So this is a disastrous situation. So the question of who caused it and who bears the blame really matters. Now, the conventional wisdom in the United States and in the West more generally is that the Russians are responsible for this. And in particular, Vladimir Putin is responsible. As I'm sure almost all of you know, I don't buy this argument at all, and I haven't bought it for a long time. In my opinion, the West bears primary responsibility for what is happening today. And it was largely a result of a decision in April 2006 to make Ukraine and to make Georgia a part of NATO. We were going to integrate Ukraine into NATO come hell or high water. Now, the Russians said at the time that this is categorically unacceptable. The Russians made it clear that they had swallowed the first two tranches of NATO expansion, the 99 expansion and the 2004 expansion, but Georgia and Ukraine were not going to become part of NATO. They were drawing a line in the sand. They said this is an existential threat to us. And indeed, in August of that year, of course, August 2008, you had a war involving the Russians and the Georgians over the whole issue of whether or not Georgia would become part of NATO. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about Western policy and we focus on NATO and expansion of NATO into Ukraine, that actually Western policy had three prongs to it. The core prong was definitely integrating Ukraine into NATO. But the other two prongs were integrating Ukraine into the European Union and turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. In effect, putting in place the Orange Revolution. And these three prongs of the strategy were all designed to make Ukraine a pro-Western country, a country in the West's orbit sitting on Russia's border. And again, the Russians made it unequivocally clear at the time that this was not going to happen. Now, the first crisis broke out in February 2014. The way I like to think about this is that you had a major crisis in February 2014, broke out that date. Then you had a major crisis breaking out in December of last year, that's December 2021, and on February 24th of this year, the war started. Now, what about this crisis in February of 2014, February 22nd to be exact? It was precipitated in large part by a coup that was supported by the United States that took place in Ukraine and resulted in a pro-Russian leader, President Yanukovych, being overthrown and being replaced by a pro-American prime minister. The Russians found this intolerable. At the same time, they were debating with the West and with the Ukrainians over EU expansion. And always in the background at that point in time was NATO expansion. This blew up, and it had two consequences. One is that the Russians, in effect, took Crimea away from Ukraine for themselves. They had no intention of ever letting Sevastopol become a NATO. The second thing that happened is that the Russians helped foster a civil war in eastern Ukraine. And of course, that civil war festered well after 2014. But the crisis really blew up in 2014. Then, starting about mid-year, and really heating up at the end of last year, I would say in December 2021, was a second major crisis. And the question is, what caused this crisis? And in my opinion, it was caused largely by the fact that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. It's commonplace in the West, especially in Washington these days, to say that Ukraine had nothing to fear regarding, the United States had nothing to fear. Russia had nothing to fear regarding Ukraine becoming part of NATO. And Russia had nothing to fear because NATO was doing nothing to move forward Ukraine's incorporation into NATO. I think in a de jure sense, that's absolutely correct. But in a de facto way, that's wrong. What we were doing was we were arming the Ukrainians. And you want to remember, it's President Trump in December of 2017 who was under great pressure, who decided to arm the Ukrainians. So we were arming the Ukrainians, we were training the Ukrainians, and we were forming ever closer diplomatic ties with the Ukrainians. And this spooked the Russians. It especially spooked the Russians in the summer of last year when the Ukrainian military used drones against Russian forces in the Donbass region. It especially spooked the Russians last summer when the British drove a destroyer through territorial waters, Russian territorial waters in the Black Sea. It especially spooked the Russians in November when we were flying bombers within 13 miles of the Russian coast. So all these events, coupled with this de facto bringing of Ukraine into NATO, pushed the Russians to what Sergei Lavrov said was the boiling point. You know, Lavrov was asked in January why the Russians had reached this point and why we were in the midst of a crisis. And he said, Lavrov said in January, we had reached our boiling point. First expansion of NATO, second expansion of NATO, and then all of these events associated with Ukraine. The Russians had it. So you had a crisis of massive proportions, which of course resulted on February 24th in the Russians invading Ukraine. And we are now in the midst of a real war. This is not just a civil war in eastern Ukraine, which is what we had before February 24th. We now have a real war.